What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through my plan for mastering the hidden leverage layer, what it is and how I'm actively thinking around solving for it and what I will be doing into the future, and also just giving you an insights or a deep dive into how I'm actively structuring this into my daily life as well. So ultimately with these videos, like always, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks. Also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and be the chief problem solvers, and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure while doing it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with the main mission of what it is that we're actively solving for, which is killing chaos, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this one's going to be a super fun one. I'm going to be diving deep into what the hidden leverage layer actually is, how I'm thinking about it, and how I'm actively, just solving that into the future. So everyone talks about input, output, hard work, results, launch, feedback, push, reward, but the real leverage is in the in between, the parts that no one actually speaks about, which is the empty space between decision and the result, and what happens within that. I personally believe is where all the gold lies, between the decision to say, hey, I'm going to be actively doing this, and the result that you get from that, which you could think of to say, hey, this is purely action based. We're basically doing actions that ultimately build what it is that we're actively doing. But in order to bridge that gap, we actively need to do that, which is something that I've also just been personally thinking about, of how can I actively just shorten the time span of me thinking of an idea and actively just implementing it. And just through this hidden leverage layer, I believe there's so much value, there's so much gold that I have seen for myself personally within this hidden leverage layer. And I think solving for this and building around this and building these mental models and frameworks for this hidden leverage layer, I think is only going to scale our operations into the future, in terms of how we're building Killer Chaos OS, and also how we're building the self, because the self is equally as important. And like always, that's where the system either compounds or collapses. So in between there, that empty space where the difference between decision and the result, or the in between part of that, is where the system either compounds or it collapses. And ultimately you want it to be built, or we especially want it to be built, in order to compound. And then basically asking, how can we actively build around this to ultimately say, hey, we need to make sure that the system is compounding in every single facet that it possibly can, rather than collapse. Because ultimately having to build around this in between hidden layer ultimately allows for me to think at least about solving for it. But ultimately building this design scales that. And I know that for most people, they don't design for that specific layer, but I am. So how am I actively doing this? What is this in between layer? What actually functions in between this hidden layer? And this is the non-obvious infrastructure, basically saying, hey, this is not the outreach, but basically how I track who didn't respond. Basically saying, hey, it's not the outreach itself outright, but actually tracking what actually happened to me, tracking with the people that didn't respond. What happens in the in-between part to say, hey, we did outreach, okay, cool, but what happens in the in-between part? I think that is where the goal is, to say, hey, this is how I'm actively tracking who didn't respond, because that ultimately allows us to build those KPIs and ultimately just understand the data. And also saying, hey, not the call itself, but rather the post-call follow-up triggers. What are the post-call follow-up triggers that we're actively implementing? Are we just having this call and then actively just saying, hey, we've had this call and that's the end of it? Or are we saying, hey, we've had this call, but what happens in between that is ultimately we're gonna just continue to provide as much value as we can? Is it through email? Is it through SMS? What is the the vehicle that we're actively just using this and pumping it through and saying, hey, it's not the win itself, but also the analysis of how I won. It's easy to think that, hey, I just won, but not doing a deep dive into the analysis of what is the in-between part of you having the call and ultimately making the decision to take that action, but the in-between part specifically. But basically saying, hey, it's basically analyzing how specifically I went about, tracking this call, how I thought through about, this win, how what are the decisions that I also took to make sure that this win was, in the bag basically, and ultimately just solely just understanding that, and also saying, hey, not the sprint itself, but basically the cooldown period. What happened in between that cooldown period ultimately is the hidden layer, and building a design or a function around that ultimately is what I think the golden nuggets is going to come from. And ultimately having this hidden layer and designing for it, I know that into the future we're going to get so many things wrong, but ultimately here having to design for each and every hidden layer, I think is ultimately going to give us those golden nuggets that is going to compound into the snowball effect that ultimately allows us to build Killer Chaos OS into this machine. But ultimately having to build around this hidden layer that most neglect because it's not obvious, it's basically the in-between parts from the the decision to the result. I think that is where the gold lies, and just solely catering and designing for each and every single part, I know is where the leverage is gonna lie, because some people don't do it, or at least from my experience that many people may not be thinking about it because it's not super obvious. But ultimately designing the infrastructure layer for this, we can basically own it for ourselves, and then also give us the competitive advantage to basically say, hey, what are we doing within our current process from making this decision to the result that ultimately allows us to break free and build our own mode, that ultimately allows us to say, hey, we are basically tracking who didn't respond, we're adding post call follow-ups sequences or triggers that ultimately allows us to then have those measures that allow us to then retarget and then get that client back on board, and also an analysis of how I won, the decision that I took in order to win, not just saying, hey, we won and that's cool, but basically documenting those decisions to say, hey, this is how I'm actively winning, this is how I'm actively thinking about it, and then scaling that up into the future, which I know is going to be super important. Simply just documenting the decisions that we're making each and every single day, I know that into the future it's just gonna 10x, and it's going to become more valuable as time goes, and saying, hey, not the sprint itself but the cooldown protocol, how can we actively just document this and also just improve on the cooldown protocol, and not just say, hey, we've basically done the sprint, but what about the cooldown protocol, what happens in the in-between part, and designing an infrastructure, designing for that specific hidden infrastructure layer. I know that into the future we're only just gonna dive deep, and we're gonna build modes that are ultimately gonna allow us to build that competitive advantage. But it's not it's not cool, it's not loud, but it's where scale gets predictable because you ultimately have control. And I think one of the most important modes or things that we want to ultimately strive for is to have as much control, because with that control it ultimately allows us to build solutions that we can basically predict what is going to happen into the future, and it doesn't take over for itself, that we still have that control that allows us to design it in a way that we need it to, so that it can ultimately function in a way that ultimately provides as much value as it possibly can. But this is where Chaos OS lives. This is making sure that Chaos OS doesn't just automate tasks, not just an automation task tool per se, but it designs confidence in the in-between. How can we basically design confidence within that in-between layer and ultimately have it scale up into the future so that it becomes predictable? And that's where the product that we're actually building, ultimately understanding that what happens in the in-between layer, we ultimately need to be able to solve for it and ultimately create a solution that allows us to scale it into the future. So that's why predictive alerts before breakdowns, so basically saying, hey, we're actively just going to be taking an approach of prediction over reaction. We're not going to react each and every single time, but we're basically going to predict. And how can we do this through prediction is ultimately going to allow us to scale into the future. But also implementing system rules that catch edge cases, basically saying, hey, we're actively catching these edge cases and ultimately using this feedback inputs in order to get sharper over time, which ultimately means that a back end thinks between moves, ultimately allowing us to become this intelligence ops brain for itself that ultimately, creates as much value as it possibly can. And it's the quiet intelligence layer that ultimately builds this. It's the one that makes the rest look like magic. But ultimately building and, solving for this in-between layer, I know that we're ultimately gonna just, refine our processes and refine how we're actively building Killer Chaos OS into the beast that we want to turn it into. But in order to do that, we're gonna fail so many times, we're gonna get so many things wrong, but ultimately just making sure that we're aware of it and just thinking through these things, I know that we're actively just going to build for it into the future. But in order to do this, we actively need to refine, and where I'm refining in this entire process comes down to reworking how follow-ups are scheduled plus personalized, basically asking the questions of how can we actively rework these follow-up sequences that we have and how they're scheduled and how they personalize them and how we personalize them. Can we actively just use different messaging and positioning in order to personalize them? How deep do we actually have to go in terms of how we're scheduling them and also personalizing them, and which chord are we trying to strike as well? And ultimately saying, hey, we actively need to create internal state tracking so that we don't lose emotional context in long builds. Ultimately saying, hey, these long builds are going to be emotionally dragging and they're going to be so many emotional factors, but ultimately how can we maintain state tracking so that we don't lose that emotional control over long builds? Because long builds take a long time, and ultimately having that clarity and that state tracking, I know into the future it's only going to be super super valuable for us, and also make us or allow us to then 10x the product as well of what it is that we're actively building. But in order to do that, we also need a Notion logs to auto summarize lost contact, lost status, also ultimately just to make sure that, hey, we're keeping track of what it is that we need to keep track on a day-to-day basis, and thinking of Killer Chaos OS as a second brain for operations. So basically, the main idea for this is I want to transform, or we want to transform Killer Chaos OS into a second ops brain for the business itself. So basically asking the questions of how can we actively transform this into a second ops brain by ultimately solving for the hidden leverage layer that we can ultimately create leverage for, the in-between part from decision to the result. How can we actively just double down on that specific layer and ultimately understand that, hey, it's not as obvious as we normally make it out to be, but how can we actively still solve for it regardless, simply because it has leverage. It can create insane amounts of leverage, but how can we actively do that? We need to make sure that we're actively aware of it and also implementing these frameworks and thoughts around it so that we can better use this way of thinking and ultimately scale that into the future. And saying, hey, auditing every wait state in our flow and replacing it with intentional triggers. How can we actively just implement these intentional triggers to make sure that we're basically building this compound effect? And that is where this compounding effect is going to be coming to, and why this matters long term is because everyone can show up, everyone can push hard, but not everyone can design resilience in the quiet moments. And that's what makes empires unbreakable. Basically saying, hey, how can we actively just build resilience in the quiet moments, in the processes or parts that no one actively thinks about so much? How can we actively just build this leverage point within this hidden leverage layer that ultimately allows the people that we're working with, the businesses that we're working with, and also us scale our operations in the long run? And that is what makes these empires unbreakable, because we're not just building tech, we're building temporal control in a way that governs what happens when no one else is watching, basically making sure that this is what separates a system from a legacy. Basically understanding that, hey, these are the specific guides on specific modes that we want to be implementing in terms of what it is that we're building on a day-to-day basis, and how do we actively do this by solving for the hidden leverage layer, of which we're super gonna dive deep on. This is uncharted territory that we're actively just solving for, and understanding that, hey, These are the specific points within the hidden leverage layer that isn't often, super flashy, but ultimately, how can we actively solve for this in the in-between parts? Because we know that there's some leverage, and we believe that in these in-between parts that, are often overlooked, we can also create insane amounts of leverage through that. But ultimately, in order to do that, we just need to make sure that we're refining the process, we're understanding what it is that we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis, adding those control measures, and also making sure that it governs what happens when no one's watching. And through that, while it's governing while no one's watching, we know that it's something that we need to also have control over. And this is how we're actively thinking, solely about that hidden leverage layer, that quiet intelligence layer that ultimately we, want to tackle and build into the future. So I'm super excited, just thinking about this. I know it's a pretty rough way to think about it, but into the future, we're gonna just dive super deep. And I'm gonna make a part 2 100% for this, so that I can dive a lot deeper and just go through the specific modes and all those deep stuff that actually makes this hidden leverage layer so important into the future. But I think this is what's gonna govern the way that we think, the way that we solve for things, and also how we scale into the future in terms of our operations on the back end, and how we're actively building the future for Killer Chaos OS. So I'm super excited. So many things to build, so many things to learn as well. And we're still in the trenches as always. We're just gonna hit the nail in the wall, try new things, fail at other things, and also ultimately just keep moving forward each and every single day. This is super rough. We're still in the trenches. We could get this completely wrong, but I know that into the future that what we're thinking about is the right way to think about it. It's only a matter of just executing and actively getting the things done, which is going to be super difficult, but always up for a challenge. And I'm super excited for that. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to, connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. And if you guys have any questions or just any comments or anything, just make sure to pop them in the comment section, and I will see you guys in the next video.